Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm back again with the next chapter of this book collecting game by A. Edward Newton. We are on to the chapter titled The Format of the English Novel. And I do apologize if the fan that's going a few feet from me is causing background noise. There's no really getting around it at this point in the year. There's a heat wave here, and if I turn that off, I'm just going to be sweltering. So bear with me on that point. So the format of the English novel. The novel undoubtedly had its beginning in the Garden of Eden when Adam, his resistance lowered from the effects of a minor operation, found Eva making eyes at him. And a notoriously wise person, was it Solomon, once observed that the way of a man with a maid was too much for him. How then shall we, who are not wise, be expected to solve the greater problem, that of a maid with man? We cannot, nevertheless, with this fascinating proposition, we shall attempt to divert ourselves for an hour. The novel is the last and most popular of the great forms of literature, and scholars have long debated where the English novel begins. But I, not having a heavy intellectual background, after making honorable mention of Robinson Crusoe, shall arbitrarily begin with Samuel Richardson. I should like to begin with Defoe, for I have a great fondness for old Dan, and I am not weak in first edition of him. But, after all, his masterpiece does not exactly meet the requirements of a novel. Defoe told stories, to be sure, but he left out one important thing. He left out sentiment, which for the purposes of this paper may be called love. It is not easy to say exactly what the requirements of the novel are, but they appear to be first met by Samuel Richardson in his Pamela, which appeared, according to the title page, in 1741. Actually, in November 1740, and was immediately and enormously successful. No book, just like Pamela, had ever appeared before, and would have greatly amazed the middle-aged tradesman if he had been told that he had set rolling a ball which had been rolling with constantly increasing acceleration ever since. And this ball in its rolling took various forms. First, it was several small volumes bound in leather. For convenience, I shall refer to this as the Age of Calf. Second, it was 2, usually 3 somewhat larger volumes bound in boards, that is to say, in the flimsiest of pasted boards with a paper label, bearing the title on its spine. This was followed by the Age of Parts. These parts came out monthly. Usually there were 20 of them, actually 19, the last being a double number. Illustrations had by now become an important feature, and the price per part was £1. Then came the Victorian Novel, 3 volumes, well printed on good paper, substantially bound in cloth, the three-decker it has been called. And finally, there is the cheap and nasty novel of today. I am speaking of the format, mind you, in 1 volume. The novel of commerce, written on a typewriter, printed and bound by machinery, sold by hundreds of thousands and forgotten as soon as read. Now let us return to Pamela. As not everyone has read Pamela, let me try to tell you very briefly what this story is about. A lady dies, leaving an unmarried son, with an indeterminate number of servants, amongst whom was Pamela, a virtuous and beautiful young woman of amazing talents. The son, taken with the girl's beauty, seeks her as his mistress. She resists, and finally, there being no other way to possess her, he offers marriage. She accepts, and they live happily ever after. That is the whole story, and Pamela tells it to her father and mother, and an interminable series of letters to which she receives occasional replies from her father, telling her to guard her chief possession, her virtue, at any cost. She assures him that she will. Now, as Dr. Johnson once remarked, anyone who reads Richardson merely for the story will hang himself. Its merit is that Pamela was sentimental, emotional, reflective. It was no mere narration of incident. And here we have Pamela in a characteristic binding. When Richardson's stories first appeared, as Dr. Cross tells us in his admirable little book on the English novel, it was usual for someone to read them aloud in the family circle. When pathetic passages were reached, the members of the family would retire to separate apartments to weep. And I just knocked my camera, didn't I? They would retire to separate apartments to, oh gracious, retire to separate apartments to weep. We are in the age of tears as well as calf, and after composing themselves, they would return to the fireside and the reading would proceed. I reread Pamela only a few months ago. I found it interesting, which its author intended it should be, and very amusing, which its author would have been greatly shocked to hear. We who read Pamela today are pretty sophisticated, and we ask ourselves, did the chaste, handsome, and intelligent servant girl carrying her eggs, her virtue that is, to the best market, have her eye on the main chance? That question has been asked for 175 years. There is no answer. Whatever her intentions, she succeeded in marrying a rich, handsome, and infatuated youth, and what more does any girl want? Mr. B's Pamela, would-be betrayer, her lover, and finally her husband, always referred to as Mr. B, certainly never for a moment supposed that Pamela had any idea that if she resisted his disgraceful and sometimes cruel overtures, he would at last lead her to the altar. But we cannot but ask ourselves the question as we read letter after letter, in which Pamela tells over and over again of the horrible traps that are laid for her, and of her fixed determination to keep her virtue though the heavens fall. She talked to her fellow servants about it, the head gardener bade her cultivate it, the head coachman urged her to let it ride. She came within an ace of losing her most cherished possession more than once. Telling her parents not to worry, she kept them constantly on the rack. After some horrible experience in which Mr. B, folding her in his arms and kissing her repeatedly, tells her how lovely she is, she escapes from him, and returning to her closet, she writes 1, 2, 5, 10 long letters to her father, telling him that she is bitterly beset, but she will die rather than yield to Mr. B. She was not familiar with that old fine blurb in Bartley Campbell's The White Slave, in which the heroine rushes down to the footlights and declares that rags are royal raiment when worn for virtue's sake. Rags are royal raiment when worn for virtue's sake. It takes a telephone operator to roll the R's properly. And she could have escaped 100 times in one from her master, but she was prevented by her desire to do her duty to him, to finish embroidering a waistcoat or some other fool thing, all the time, I fancy, making eyes at her lover, until he finally becomes so enamored of her and so exhausted by the chase that he offers to marry her. Immediately upon receiving the blessing of the clergyman, Mr. B's faults are forgotten, and he becomes the most admirable of men. This forgiving nature argues well for his continued happiness. Pamela's lover and husband is a great gentleman. It would be disgraceful to mention his name. But finally, Henry Fielding announced that he had discovered the carefully guarded secret. Mr. B's name, he said, was Bobby. It is not easy for us today, surrounded by every form of novel, to realize the immense vogue of Pamela. Servant girls who could read, read it. So did duchesses, so did men about town, and men who could only spell out the story with difficulty. 4 editions, something unheard of for a book of the kind, were published within 6 months. It was translated and dramatized, and it was sung and it was burlesqued by Fielding in a small and very rare little volume called Shamala, and finally in a full-length novel, Joseph Andrews. Joseph is Pamela's brother, and he resists the lewd advances of his mistress very much in the manner in which his virtuous sister resisted Mr. B. This made Richardson very angry, but he recovered his temper and was unable to withstand the temptation of adding to the original 2 volumes 2 more in which Pamela's conduct as an affectionate wife, a faithful friend, a polite neighbor, and an indulgent mother are recounted at endless such length that one finally tosses the volume aside and takes up something else. In due course, Pamela was followed by Tom Jones. And here we have Tom Jones in Old Calf, which is, all things considered, the greatest of English novels. The story goes that the manuscript was offered by Fielding, who was hard-pressed for money, to a second-rate publisher for a nominal sum, but it was refused. By the advice of Thomson the poet, Fielding then went to Andrew Miller, the great publisher of the day, who, as was his habit with works of light reading, handed the manuscript to his wife, who advised him by no means to let it slip through his fingers. Miller then invited Fielding and Thomson to meet and drink at a coffee house in the Strand, where after dinner the bookseller, with some hesitation, offered Fielding £600. The novelist was amazed at the largeness of the author. "My good sir," he cried, "the book is yours, give me your hand. And the waiter, bring us a couple of bottles of your best port." Before Miller died, he had cleared £18,000 by his bargain, out of which he is said to have made Fielding various presents to the amount of £2,000, and when he died he bequeathed a handsome legacy to each of the author's sons. Well may Dr. Johnson, who was a great friend of the publisher, have said, "Sir Andrew Miller is the Maecenas of the age." When Johnson undertook to butter a man, he buttered him good, and when he hated a man, he hated him the same way. He once said he loved a good hater. Gibbon too knew how to turn a phrase, no one better. Never, I suppose, has a novel been praised so magnificently and immortally as when, in his autobiography, he refers to Tom Jones as the exquisite picture of human manners, which will outlive the palace of the Escurial and imperial eagle of the House of Austria, a prophecy one half of which was already come true. Tom Jones was published on the 28th of February 1749, and note, if you please, its publishers announced in a newspaper of that date. Following the title of the book is this: It being impossible to get sets bound fast enough to answer the demand for them, such gentlemen and ladies as please may have them sewed in blue paper and boards at the price of 16 shillings a set. And a few years ago, when one of these unbound copies turned up at Sessler's bookshop in Philadelphia, it brought exactly the price which Fielding received for the manuscript, namely £600, and my friend Jerome Kern bought it, beating me to it for the reason which he had the money and I hadn't. I saw it first. Between 1749, the year of Tom Jones, and 1816, when a perfect novel, Emma, appeared, no advance had been made in telling a story. I have called Emma a perfect novel. I think it is. Jane Austen used a small palette, but her colours were faultless. Lord Rosebery ranks Emma as the second best novel in the English language, placing Tom Jones first. Listen to what Kipling says of the author of Emma. Jane lies in Winchester, blessed by her shade. Praise the Lord for making her, and her of all she made. And while the stones of Winchester or Milsom Street remain, glory, love, and honour unto England's Jane. There was a serious blemish in Tom Jones, and the same kind of blemish appears in Nicholas Nickleby, 1839. The progress of both narratives is interrupted by the recital of one or more long stories which have nothing whatever to do with the main theme. They do nothing but interrupt it. In 1859, another novel, Adam Bede, was published. Again, a woman produced a faultless novel. No author's name appeared on the title page of Emma, and on the title page of Adam Bede was the one misleading name of George Eliot. Both novels were, as we know, written by women. Fiction is the one art in which women rank equally with men. We now believe that every incident in a story should have some bearing on the characters in that story, and that characters should develop logically out of the situations in which they find themselves. In support of my position, let me quote 2 paragraphs from the Upton Letters, that now almost forgotten volume of essays, in which its author says, "What I want in a novel is to step as simply as possible into the presence of an emotion, the white heat of a situation. With Henry James," Benson was speaking of Henry James, "I do not feel certain that the situation is. Who does? I would inquire." Let me digress to quote the wag who remarked that Henry James' first work fell naturally into 3 periods: James first, James second, and James the Old Pretender. I wish I had said that, but it is something to repeat it. Returning again to the Upton Letters, the writer says, "I want to get at what there is without a mental agility, which is unnecessarily fatiguing. A novel ought to be like a walk. George Meredith makes it into an obstacle race. There's a fine bit of criticism. That Meredith is caviar to the general may be admitted, but so much the worse for the general. And now as to the format of all these celebrated novels. Format is a French word which has been anglicized, and which is defined in the concise Oxford Dictionary as the shape and size of a book, to which definition I, for the purposes of this paper, would add the word style. Pamela was first published in 2 small volumes of about 400 pages each, the size of the page being 6 1/4 inches by 3 3/4 inches. Each volume was bound in calf. I do not mean to suggest that it was not possible to obtain the volumes in wrappers unopened, that is to say, stitched merely in a blue-gray paper without any indication whatever of the title thereon. It probably was, but speaking generally, and I shall so speak throughout this paper, the book was strongly sewed and trimmed with a binder's knife and bound in calf. It probably had its title in gold letters upon a little leather label, or so perhaps it had nothing whatever on the back except the number of the volume, and even this was occasionally omitted. But in any event, we are in the age of calf. Dr. Johnson, in 1759, writing to his friend Strahan in regard to Rossalis, says, "The story will make 2 volumes like Little Pompadour, that is, about 1 middling volume." Pompadour was a rather naughty little book, which had appeared the year before, but it shows that the thought of the world had turned towards small books. And Johnson's farther observation was that A small book which could be held easily in the hand and carried to the fireside was the most useful after all, to which I am sure we all agree. In brief, in the middle of the 18th century, when the novel came in, the fashion was for small books, well printed, on good paper, and bound in calf. And these are the books so much in demand today. Pamela has always been a scarce book, and while it is still possible to procure a copy, you will be lucky if you stumble upon one within a year in an old binding, and at $2,500, perhaps twice as much, it is indeed potentially a $10,000 book. Leather, calf, was indeed the obvious binding. It was leather or nothing. In the 18th century, the reading habit was not general, and books were bought only by people of means and cultivation. Occasionally, these old books were bound in paper boards with a calf back, or in a blue-gray paper, and as this was looked upon as a merely temporary binding, there was usually no lettering of either title or volume number on the spine, and this is the condition in which the fastidious collector will endeavor to secure his books, if he can. In boards uncut. Uncut, of course, does not mean unopened. It merely means not cut with a binder's knife, which necessarily reduces the size of the volume. In a rare book, size is a matter of the utmost importance. Life, to be worth living, must have an occasional thrill. To see a book advertised as of especial value because of its wide margins, and then to discover that your own copy is a quarter of an inch taller or wider, is a joy to the collector, and an innocent one. All of Richardson's novels were published in small volumes, as were also Fielding's, Smollett's, and Sterne's. Smollett, in my opinion, does not rank with Fielding or with Sterne, but Peregrine Pickle is a good story. And here we have Peregrine Pickle in 4 volumes there. And we also have Cranford, No Gentler, Sweeter Story Was Ever Written, over here on the right. But there are 3 other famous books which must never be overlooked in any consideration of 18th century novels, each one characteristic not only of its author, but of a class. There is Rassalas, which dear Miss Jenkins and Cranford referred to, Pickwick, The Vicar of Wakefield, and Evelina. All of these famous books were bound in calf. And here we have a title page of the first English edition of the world's greatest novel, the history of the Volarovs and witty knight-errant Don Quixote, translated out of the Spanish. So all of these famous books were bound in calf, and it may fairly be presumed that if and when they were acquired in sheets, after being read, they were usually sent to the binders and put in leather covers. My copy of Sterne's Sentimental Journey, however, remains in its original condition, sewed in blue paper, and my Tristram Shandy is in the boards, but I shall deal with boards presently. Much ink has been shed in an effort to solve the mystery of Edwin Drood, but I never heard of anyone attempting to guess how A Sentimental Journey would have ended had its author lived to finish it. As it is, it ends where it begins, in the middle. Indeed, in the middle of a paragraph. Alas, poor Yorick, his life ended in the middle too. He always enjoyed poor health. Listen to him on the subject. O blessed health, thou art above all golden treasure. 'Tis thou who enlargest the soul, and openest all its powers to receive instruction, and to relish virtue. He that has thee has little more to wish for, and he that is so wretched as to want thee wants everything from thee. Sterne. The desire to supplement his clerical income led Sterne, who had already published several volumes of sermons and the like, to publish in 1760 2 volumes of Tristram Shandy. These volumes bear no publisher's imprint or place of publication. Dr. Cross of Yale, the one great authority on Sterne, does not know whether these 2 volumes were printed in London or in York. Therefore, it is useless for us to guess about it. But on January 1st, 1760, the London Chronicle makes this announcement. This day was published, printed on a superfine writing paper, a new letter in 2 volumes, price 5 shillings, neatly bound, the life and opinions of Tristram Shandy. Neatly bound can mean nothing but calf. And here we have Tristram Shandy in boards, up here on the top of the page. And back on the previous page, we have a frontispiece of the second edition of the first part and the first edition of the second part of the world's greatest novel. So this is Don Quixote again. And the author, Newton will get to Don Quixote. The illustrations just seem to be preceding that part of this chapter. The remaining volumes were published in London. The last appeared in 1767, and it is usual to find Sterne's signature in volumes 5, 7, and 9. Occasionally, unscrupulous booksellers suggest that these were Sterne's own copies, whereas this was merely Sterne's way of indicating to his customers that they were buying the authorized edition of his book, which was so enormously successful that a pirated edition, printed in Dublin, almost immediately made its appearance on the London market. Tristram is a trifle smaller than either Pamela or Tom Jones, my bound copy being exactly the size of my bound Risalis. The earlier book may indeed have served as a model for the latter, both having the same page appearance and 20 lines to the page. Sweet little books they are, and only now beginning to be appreciated by the collector. It is curious that for so many years, 18th century prose has been so neglected. The avidity with which scarce 17th century drama has been sought by collectors, who hardly read a line of it, the very titles of which would bring a blush to the cheek of a girl in the Follies, meantime neglected some of our greatest prose, which is a delight to read. This is one of those vagaries of collecting for which no explanation is offered. The small calf-bound book continued to be the fashion until after the turn of the century. Then, with the increasing number of readers, it was discovered that leather was expensive and paper boards came into use. The exact moment that the change took place, it is impossible to say. No doubt it was gradual, and the two types overlapped. But a new generation of novelists had come upon the scene. Jane Austen, Sir Walter Scott, Peacock, Buller Lytton, and our own Fenimore Cooper, all published in boards with a paper label. The poets of the period, Byron, Keats, Shelley, and the early Tennysons were all published in boards. The reasoning of the publisher was doubtless this: authors are a rapacious lot. If we have to pay them what they demand, we must bring out their books in cheaper format. Instead of calf, we shall use paper boards, and the little leather label stamped in gold must give way to a paper label printed in black. Instead of having to trim the book with the binder's knife, we shall leave it uncut. The reader can cut the pages with a paper knife, and if, after reading, he wants to have the book properly bound, there will be plenty of margin. This was excellent reasoning, and doubtless the Napoleonic Wars made certain economies desirable, if not necessary. In any event, by the time Jane Austen had begun to publish, boards were the style, and the fashion spread from the novel to the volume of poetry. Then, just as the novel in its negligee became established, an entirely new style arose. Enter the age of parts. And so we have a title page of The Vicar of Wakefield. We have early Tennyson's in boards in the corner here, and over here we have Emma, a perfect copy of a perfect book in 3 volumes. Who does not delight to look at pictures that tell a story? The English certainly do, and with the final overthrow of Napoleon, they had a lot of money to spend, and some of it they spent on books published in monthly parts. Albert M. Cohen, with whom I have crossed swords as to the first issue of the first edition of A Christmas Carol, is of the opinion that the Annals of Gallantry is the first book of any importance to be so published. But this is hardly a novel. It may be that Mr. Cohen is not aware that Robinson Crusoe was published in parts. It appeared in the original London Post on Heathcote's Intelligence. The story begins in the number of Wednesday, October 7th, 1719, the year of publication in the book form, and ends in the issue of October 19th, 1720. The book is extremely rare. Only 3 copies are known. The Grenville copy in the British Museum, which is very imperfect, my own copy, which has but 1 leaf in excellent facsimile by Harris, and one which was sold at auction in Sotheby's in March 1928, when it brought, with a few unimportant Defoe items, about $15,000. But this is hardly publication in parts, in the accepted sense of the word. It is really the first serial publication of a novel in a newspaper, but Life in London by Pierce Egan undoubtedly is. This famous book, and here is Life in London in pictorial boards. This famous book, Life in London, or The Day and Night Scenes of Jerry Hawthorne, Esquire, and his elegant friend Corinthian Tom, accompanied by Bob Logic, the Oxonian, in their rambles and sprees through the metropolis, to give it its full title, was dedicated by permission to His Most Gracious Majesty King George IV. This work was the earliest important example of monthly parts, at a shilling each. It was enormously popular. For years there was not a man, not a gentleman that is, in England, but knew the book almost by heart, and there were many in this country who knew it as well. Today it is valued for its description of what is called the sporting life of a century ago, and for its excellent illustrations by Cruikshank. As soon as its issue in parts was completed, it came out in illustrated boards, which is the form in which the collector will want the book parts, being utterly impossible. From this rather questionable origin sprang the issue of many books in parts, which reached their apotheosis in Pickwick, but this was not until some years later. Meantime, Rudolf Ackermann had taken a hand in the game. His tours of Dr. Syntax, the joint work of Rowlandson and Combe, are really novels in verse. Rowlandson's drawings gave point and humor to Combe's texts, and between artist and artisan, they syntaxed the world. It is sad to think how little fun there is on this planet of ours. I suppose that is why a book with a trace of the real article has a chance for a long life. By the end of the first quarter of the 19th century, a great change had come over England. Wealth was pouring in, and with the use of steam power and the growth of manufacturing, mass production for the first time. This wealth was no longer exclusively in the hands of the great country families. It was widely distributed. The public, which a generation earlier had bought but few books, came into the market, and books in parts became so fashionable that several which had been originally issued in cloth, which was just coming into use, were reissued in parts, a notable instance being Sketches by Boz. And that is Sketches by Boz in parts. And now, at the outset of the consideration of parts, one comes upon one of the several difficulties which confront the collector. The paper on which the parts were printed was not too good. They contained plates, that is to say, illustrations printed from copper plates. And copper was very soft in those days. They have advertisements and they have covers, and all of these must be right. The difference between a right and a wrong, Pickwick say, is today about $15,000. And here is Pickwick in parts, and on the right we have The Way We Live Now by Trollope in parts. To return to Sketches by Boz, it was issued in 20 parts in pink paper wrappers. It had 40 illustrations by George Cruikshank. Part 2 should contain a 2-page address of the publishers, apologizing because there was less printed matter in the parts than there was in Pickwick. And Part 5 should contain a 3-page proclamation signed Boz. If one does not know these points and buys a copy bound up from the parts, these advertisements will almost certainly be omitted, even if some of the covers are bound in as a sort of guarantee of good faith. Harry B. Smith, who once owned what I consider the most interesting Pickwick in the world, which now belongs to my friend William M. Elkins of Philadelphia, tells in his catalogue, entitled A Sentimental Library, of the early wanderings of this famous book, how it went to India with its owner, who died there, whereupon his widow, returning to England, thought it would be nice to have the parts bound up for the children to read, and how the binder inquired whether the covers were to be discarded, each of which bore an inscription from Charles Dickens. It is these covers which give the Elkins Pickwick its unique interest today. It is impossible for one, for me at least, to overcome the prejudice of a lifetime, and fearing that I shall not be fair to the subject of books in parts, which give others, and it may be wiser, collectors than myself such a thrill, I shall again quote a writer who has said, "When A. Edward Newton talks about books in parts, do not listen to him. If not to him, then listen to my critic on the subject. To one who appreciates a book as it left the loving hands of the author from whose brain it sprang, a work in the paper parts possesses a flavor that is unsurpassed even by original boards uncut. Each page is a joy unto itself, and should there be a leaf of the advertisement lacking, there will be the hunt of an odd part to supply the defect. It is a game not without the excitement of the chase, for the wanted oddment is very elusive, and the pleasure of finding it is very great. How fascinating it is to turn the pages of those old advertisers, whose perfect presence may alter the value of a copy from £50 to £1,000. We have been told so frequently that advertising is an American art, that we have come to believe it. Our great magazines are indeed bought and read quite as much for their advertising pages as for their reading matter. The national advertiser, as he is called, draws attention to his wares with such superlative skill that we are apt to feel that everything has been and is and will continue to be wrong with us until and unless we take his advice. How often have I wished that my garments had the distinguished cut and fit of those advertised in certain popular monthlies, which they never have because I buy them in London and not in Chicago. I ponder, would it not be wise for me to spend my remaining days polishing my remaining teeth with Blank's dental cream? And I've gone so far as to consider whether I should not take to smoking Dromerty cigarettes, that I might get that look of splendid determination which seems to result from their use. Although smoking a cigarette is to me like kissing a girl through a pane of glass. It is very hygienic and all that sort of thing, but with little kick to it. We think we are very clever in our advertising, but take down from your shelves, if you can, a faultless Pickwick, mine for example, if I may say so, and read the advertisement therein. I read and wonder whether Parker's Grecian compound will change my hair from its present grey to its original lustrous black, which it never was, whether I ought not to lay in a supply of Russian corn cure against an hour of pain, whether it is not my duty to buy a bottle of the bloom of Nignon de l'Eclos, with which my wife may restore that schoolgirl complexion, which a certain soap of our day has been unable to do, whether we ought not to have a box of the Widow Welch's female pills in the house, the recipe for which was bequeathed to her by her late husband, as she swore it was before the Lord Mayor at the Mansion House on the 3rd day of November, 1798. All these things, and 100 more, must be right before one hands over his cheque for the price of a small house and receives in exchange a little bundle of 19 tender pamphlets, which can never again be touched for fear of injury. The accepted authority on Pickwick is my friend John C. Eccles. He keeps a bibliographical stud book for each great Pickwick as a pedigree, which is always at the service of his friends. The latest news is that he has published it. It may be that I have treated with too great levity some of the necessary advertisements of a perfect Pickwick, and I may also fail to refer to the plates with the reverence they deserve. It is supposed by Mr. Eccles that there were printed about 400 copies of the first part, which appeared on the last day of March 1836. In its early numbers, Pickwick was not a success. Indeed, it was not until the appearance of Sam Weller that the book caught the taste of the town. Then there was a rush for early parts. Much has been written about the genesis of the book. The idea of a Cockney sportsman on tour seems to have been suggested to the publishers, Chapman and Hall, by Robert Seymour, and the first illustrator and the creator of the accepted portrait of Pickwick. Mr. Hall took up the idea and sent for Dickens, then an obscure journalist, and asked him to do the text. He accepted the commission. He was at the time only 24, and he was, as he remained all his life, very touchy. Promptly he quarreled with the illustrator, who, to the horror of all, committed suicide, and another illustrator, Buss, took upon the work, his plates appearing in Part 3, but it was immediately seen that Buss had not caught the spirit of Pickwick, and he disappeared to the satisfaction of the author, the publisher, and the public. Thackeray himself is our authority for the statement that he applied for the job of illustrator after Seymour's death, but his sketches did not please Dickens and were declined. Luckily, as it turned out, else we might have had no Esmond or Vanity Fair, and luckier still perhaps, Halbert K. Brown, Phiz, was accepted and was able to merge his genius in that of the author. Here we have Vanity Fair in parts. The copper plates on which the original sketches for Pickwick were etched almost immediately began to show signs of wear, and with the increased and ever-increasing demand for parts, were engraved and re-engraved several times, and seemingly unimportant changes in them were made, and at this point the fun or perplexity begins again. Turn to Part 1. Have the inside cover advertisements thereon? If they have, throw them away. They are no good. They should be blank. In the plate, Mr. Pickwick addresses the club, one of the most famous illustrations in any books. Are the buttons of Mr. Pickwick's vest on the right side or the left? This makes a lot of difference. Difference. In the second plate is the milkmaid well defined. If she is faint, well, it's not a crime, but it's a great misfortune. Has the gamekeeper's gun a lock and trigger in the third plate? It should have. Most copies have not. In the next plate is the floor composed of 10 boards or 11. If 11, have a carpenter in and remove one, and so throughout the book. We can hardly realize today the immense furrow created by Pickwick. In its infancy, it was not a lusty child, but as it approached manhood, it outgrew almost the strength, resource of its creators. In number 12, the publishers announced that 20,000 copies were being printed, and this was increased to 29,000 for the final numbers. The world had never seen anything like it before, and the rage in almost 100 years has not yet subsided. When a great copy comes up for sale, as there did on the evening of December 7th, 1927, at the American Art Association, there is great to-do among bibliophiles and collectors, and only mild amazement is expressed when a copy fetches a record price of $16,300. A superbly fine Pickwick in parts is a heritage for one's children. This in spite of the fact that, as Edmund Lester Pearson has said, a novel in original parts is about as useful as an automobile in parts. And was it not Carolyn Wells who called this sort of collecting the idiot's delight? Well, so is playing solitaire, and yet wise and busy men recreate themselves with this game. If I have enlarged upon Pickwick, it is not only because it is the greatest book that ever appeared in parts, but because it has no more points than any other book of its kind, and has been more closely studied. But Vanity Fair, with illustrations by the author, should not be forgotten. It makes its appearance in parts in some 10 years later than Pickwick, and, like it, has a complicated bibliography. As a book in parts, neither Pickwick nor Vanity Fair is beautiful. The distinction of beautiful books in parts belongs, it seems to me, to the Surrey novels, to the comic history of Rome and the comic history of England, and perhaps because of their fascinating color plates of Leech. These, the Surrey novels, I have them all, but all in cloth, except Mr. Romford's Hounds, of which I have 2 in parts on account of interesting variations. So we have Mr. Romford's Hounds here, and a fine 3-decker of Jane Eyre. And I have never heard of Mr. Romford's Hounds at all. My Rome and England are as fresh as the day of issue, presentation copies signed by both author and illustrator. It was possible to get such things once. As the age of calf overlapped the age of boards, and boards overlap parts, so parts overlap the 3-volume novel in cloth, the 3-decker. It was just about 100 years ago that publishing conditions became modern, if I may use the word. It has been customary for a country gentleman, immediately upon his arrival in town, to visit Ackermann's. The country gentleman's tastes were not over-refined. Squire Western and Tom Jones is not overdrawn. He was a sportsman given to robust living. He thought of himself, when he thought at all, as a lord of creation, and he would have been bewildered had he been told that he was on the verge of an era when books would be written by women, for women. But so it was. Hannah More, Jane Austen, Miss Edgeworth, Mrs. Gaskell, the Brontes, George Eliot. These were the writers who revolutionized the reading world. The end of the colored plate book was just about coincident with the end of the first third of the 19th century, and about the same time lending libraries began to play an important role in the success or failure of a novel. They sprang up all over England, but they were quickly outdistanced by the metropolitan libraries, and by the time that the Brontes and George Eliot had reached the fullness of their fame, an institution such as Moody's had become more powerful than any publisher or group of publishers. All was running like clockwork. The length of the novel was prescribed by the libraries. It must be 3 volumes. The royalty was to be what it was. The publisher was to see to that and make the best terms with the author he could, but the price was established, 31 shillings and 6 pence, which made it practically prohibitive for anyone but the very rich to buy a novel outright. So few did. Finally, Moody became so arrogant that he presumed to dictate the manner in which the author should handle his material. Love, of course, was to continue to motivate the novel, but there were to be no low amours. A duchess might have a love affair, but not a servant girl. Queen Victoria was on her throne and was very particular, as was an old lady who wrote to William Moody, the would-be censor of public taste, and told him that a novel by George Moore, a modern lover, had offended her taste, and that of another lady she knew. A Modern Lover had been published in 1883 by Old Tinsley, the sponsor for many other famous novels. For half a century, the three-decker, well printed in bold type on good paper and substantially bound in cloth and lettered in gold, had weathered all gales. A fleet of battleships could hardly seem more enduring than a fleet composed of such units as Lady Audley's Secret, Jane Eyre, Adam Bede, The Moonstone, Richard Fervell, and Lorna Dunn, to mention only a few. But a submarine had been invented which was destined to blow the fleet sky high. George Moore was it. George Moore is Irish. An Irishman loves to fight. When he found the shelves of Moody's closed to him, he scented a fight, and was in his element. "What ho!" he cried, "the library is closed to me. Very well, never again shall I publish a 3-volume novel. Hereafter I make my appeal direct to the public. My next novel shall be in 1 volume and shall sell for 6 shillings. Moody sent for him and begged him to stop rocking the boat. He tried by persuasion and by threats to force him to see the errors of his ways, but in vain. "Don't you think," said Moore, "the Lord is just as much interested in the amours of a servant girl as he is in the indiscretions of a duchess?" Moody's, however, had not sent for Moore to discuss ethics. He had sent for him to tell him what he was to do and when. It soon became a free-for-all fight, and many entered or were drawn in. A Mummer's Wife came out in 1 volume at 6 shillings, and was an immense success. 4 editions appeared within the year. People were glad to get a book which they could own and take their time over, and finally place on their shelves. The whole story is told in an interesting pamphlet called Literature at Nurse or Circulating Morals, a copy of which, inscribed to William Wilde, Oscar's brother, with George Moore's compliments, is before me. The battle became a general engagement. One by one, 3-deckers went down. Publishers began to look the libraries in the face and tell them where to go. The sea had been in some measure prepared for the slender craft soon to be launched upon it. It had been customary for publishers to issue cheap 1-volume editions of a book after its sale and 3 luxurious volumes had ceased. Now, instead of waiting a year or 2 for a popular novel to appear at a price within the reach of all, it came out at that price upon the date of first publication. And the competition between rival publishers made them spare no pains to give the most they could for the money, in paper, type, and binding, with this farther advantage, that interminably long novels almost ceased to be written. The fight was not won at once, it took time. It seems perfectly clear now that there could have been but one result, but 35 years ago it required courage, persistence, and a series of good novels to break down a tradition almost as old as the novel itself. Fortunately, of courage there was sufficient, and good novels were forthcoming as needed. So it is to George Moore, rather than to any other man, that we owe the 1-volume novel, printed on good paper, in clear, legible type, and at a price within our reach. And with the change from 3 volumes to 1, there came another change. When novels were published in parts, they were infernally padded. A certain amount of space had to be filled each month. If the story had been carried as far as it was wise in that part, a good incident was kept for the following issue. Pick up Virginian, say, and you will see the padding sticking out. The 3-volume novel also was too long, too full of words masquerading as ideas. With the 1-volume novel, a man or a woman said what he had to say and quit. The change in form, then, is at least to some extent responsible for the change in style. It may be treason to say so, but the candid reader will admit that much of the great Victorian novels would be much improved if they were shorter. Novelists wrote under pressure and for money, just as Shakespeare wrote his plays and as novelists do today, and when parts went out of style and the 3-decker became the vogue, one still had to fill a certain number of pages. This accounts for the unnecessary length of countless excellent novels, including those of my favorite author, Anthony Trollope. Today we ask that a writer tell us his story, one story at a time, and have done. Of course, long novels still appear, but they are tours de force, as it were, or if they were very long, they are broken up into sections or epochs, each complete in itself, as in Galsworthy's Forsyth Saga. and even this work of genius came out in sections over a period of years and is now long enough. An interesting question for debate would be, are we today producing novels that will be read 100 years from now, as we are today reading Emma, or Say, or Cranford? I think that we are, looking back to see that the continuity of English literature is unbroken. If I may venture to prophesy, I should say that the Forsyth saga will probably be read 100 years hence, with more interest than it is today. Consider The Damnation of There and Where, Connor Carter of Cartersville, Casuals of the Sea, Joanna Godden, Ethan Frome. Lots of good stories are being written. The difficulty is that the average is so high that to write an outstanding novel is today almost impossible. Moby Dick, the greatest book written on this continent, is sure to live, if one may speak of that great epic as of today. It is 75 years old, but it is now only coming into its own. Of Conrad, I, who cannot read him, say nothing because I know nothing. One drawback to collecting the novels of today should be mentioned. With the cheap and pulpy paper now almost invariably used, where will these books be physically a century hence? The paper will turn to dust, and the book will come to pieces. In most cases, this is not to be regretted. A new note in bibliography was introduced into the book collecting game with the publication of books in cloth. What cloth binding was used on the original first edition, and what on following editions or remainders. When boards were in vogue, they were indeed little more than the cases for the sheets or quires which go to make up the book. When, however, cloth binding became elaborate and increasingly expensive, publishers ordered only a limited number bound up in the first instance. Then they ordered further copies from the binder as the demand for the book warranted. Here one has a clue, or a problem as the case may be, as to what is the first issue of the first edition supplied by the binding as well as by the sheets. I collect Hardy, and I have 2 copies of the first edition of The Woodlanders, 3 volumes, green cloth, Macmillan, 1887. Seemingly they are identical, but one is bound in pebbled green cloth with a heavy border, within a narrow border, both borders having square corners. The other is in a smooth green cloth, and the inside border is much narrower than the first one mentioned and has round quarters. It makes no difference to me which is a credit of the first edition. I have both. But what if some careful student of the novel, like my friend Morris L. Parrish, rises up and says, the first issue of The Woodlander should have no side stamp, whatever. Then what, I ask you? One has to be very careful in the matter of what may be called remainder binding, which is always cheaper in character than that used originally. A remainder binding is an abomination to be avoided. In a remainder, it may be that a large volume has, by trimming away its margins, been turned into a small one, or a 3-volume novel may be bound up in 2 or even in 1 volume. Such volumes are not to be touched by the discriminating collector at any price, unless indeed, as Michael Sadler says, it might perchance be Hardy's Desperate Remedies. And here is Desperate Remedies right here. 3 volumes and 1 large volume. A remainder looks about as much like a proper first as a counterfeit bill looks like a genuine one. The end papers of a cloth-bound volume call for a word of comment. Originally, end papers and blank leaves, which in the case of very rare books are matters of the greatest importance, were once an integral part of the signature or quire, but gradually surfaced or colored or flowered end papers came into vogue and afford another subject for discussion. Indeed, the battle still rages as to the priority of green or lemon end papers in the case of the first issue of A Christmas Carol. Sadler says the Victorian end papers were frequently something between a cream and a yellow in shade with an opaque and chalky surface, and afford another clue as to whether the volume is remaindered or not. General advertisements, too, and publishers' announcements, dated and otherwise, still remain to perplex the tyro. Usually these are a part of a separate printing and immediately precede the end papers at the back of the book. Only experience, a good bibliography, or the advice of a reliable bookseller will be of service here. To generalize is to bewilder. Indeed, to collect Stevenson, Hardy, Conrad, or Kipling, especially Kipling, without a good bibliography is to head straightway for a lunatic asylum. Only the close student can have any idea of the years of study and work which go to the making of a modern bibliography. In support of this statement, see Henry Clinton's Hutchinson's Robinson Crusoe and its printing. Some modern books are very beautiful, others are inexcusably ugly. With the general use of fine, smooth cloth, it is possible to use heavy gold ornamentation with good effect. For certain classes of books, books containing illustrations, usually beautiful stampings, sometimes decorate the cover. And here are some examples of modern books and beautiful cloth bindings. We bound books beautifully in cloth in this country 75 years ago, and a series of lovely little volumes illustrated by Hugh Thompson occurs to me. In this type of binding, no one excelled the publication of Macmillan. On the other hand, Moby Dick, published by Harper and Brothers, is, with the possible exception of The Education of Henry Adams, the ugliest book I know. An English edition of Melville's book, under the title of The Whale, was published in 3 volumes in 1851 by Richard Bentley. Michael Sadler, in his excellent Excursions in Victorian Bibliography, says that the English edition predates the American edition. I had unsuccessfully sought this edition for years, and had just about made up my mind to live and die without a copy of this excessively scarce book, when I heard that a rival collector, B. George Eluzio of Atlantic City, had one. Knowing that money would not tempt him to part with it, I wrote and suggested an exchange. He declined what I offered, but added, "Since you want The Whale so badly, I'm sending it to you with compliments." I believe this incident to be unique in book collecting annals. It is now admitted that Moby Dick, or The Whale, call it as you will, is one of the finest pieces of literature in the English language. The first English edition was 500 copies. It may be that the first New York edition was no larger. A few people read the book and threw it aside. For 70 years the book and the author were forgotten. Then came the awakening and immortality. Tomlinson, who writes of the sea as no other man now living does, says Moby Dick is the greatest thing written in America since the Declaration of Independence. Why lug in the Declaration? Let us remain calm. Since the war, the cost of all the items that go into bookmaking has risen so enormously that publishers have been forced once again to the general use of books in boards, with a cloth back strip with a paper label. This, even if it cannot be helped, is much to be regretted, for books bound so will not last even the brief period that time allots to the modern book. I know no pleasanter occupation than collecting the great novels of our language. The 17th century poets, so much esteemed, are practically unattainable. And that's quite funny, because here I am reading his work in a book made in boards with a paper label that has survived here 100 years. The great poems of the 18th century are priceless. It is hardly worthwhile to tell the average collector to get the Travellers and the Villages and the Elegies, but he can still find the 18th century novels in calf, and some desirable books and boards, and some of the great books and parts. When he comes to the 3-deckers, he will find his work cut out for him. But if the game were easy, there would be no sport in it, and while you are buying the great novels, read them. They are good reading. Our fiction may not be as tremendous as Russia's, but who would live forever in an atmosphere of crime and punishment? There is something to be said for John Halifax, gentlemen, and here's good luck to Wilkins' Micawber. And an illustration of Micawber, as well as a Trollope Book Club edition on the left here. And that brings us to the end of the format of the English novel. We have one final chapter here, which is titled 100 Good Novels, and I'll be back with that on Wednesday.